Welcome everybody to CSIS. My name is Moises Rendon. I'm the director of the Future Venezuela Initiative and fellow of the Americas program here at CSIS. I would like to welcome those watching online as well. We usually have a very active audience joining us online, particularly for this event. We got a lot of interest coming from the region, countries like Colombia, Panama, Canada. There are people watching. So I will welcome those watching online too. The video is going to be recorded and it's going to be available after the event finishes. So if anyone missed the live stream, and you can always rewatch it on our website. We're discussing today sanctions in Venezuela, whether sanctions are working or not in the Venezuelan context. As the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela continues to deteriorate, a debate has risen among policymakers on whether sanctions are, helping the Venezuelan people or harming the Venezuelan people. So we're going to have that debate today. I think is highly relevant, and just to put it in the context, right? Like the U.S., the Lima Group, the European Union, and other like-minded nations continue to increase pressure on Maduro, mainly with diplomatic pressures, but also not recognizing his legitimacy as the legitimate government of Venezuela. But the question remains, is sanctions convincing Maduro to step down despite external support by Russia, Cuba, China, and a few other countries? Maduro is more alienated than ever before in the war. But again, sanctions, diplomatic isolation have not convinced Maduro yet to leave power. And in fact, Maduro has proven to be resilient and has been proven to be adaptable to sanctions. So today, a panel of experts will assess the efficacy of sanctions, including what is and what is not working, what are the implications for U.S. foreign policy, the energy sector in Venezuela, and the impact on Venezuelan humanitarian crisis and its struggle to restore democracy. Before that, I'm honored to introduce a colleague and a friend of Venezuela who is on the front line, Carrie Peticca. Carrie is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cuba and Venezuela at the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Prior to this position, Carrie served as a senior policy advisor for the U.S. mission to the United Nations, where she advised Ambassador Nikki Haley on issues related to counterterrorism, the Middle East, and Western Hemisphere affairs. Carrie has first-hand experience in philanthropy, innovation, among other issues. In her spare time, Carrie competes in obstacle course races and volunteers at the Silver Spring Volunteer Fire Department, where she's trying to become a firefighter. So, Carrie, you're definitely, without doubt, you're much better than me on multitasking. Carrie went to the University of Virginia, UVA, where she graduated with a degree in religious studies. Thank you for joining us, Carrie. This is very important. Thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I think even with my volunteer fire department service, the biggest fire I have to put out is Nicolás Maduro and what he's doing to the region. So it's good training. Thank you very much for hosting this event, and thank you to CSIS, which always hosts especially timely and relevant events. Sanctions and their role in U.S. policy is an especially important topic today as we reassess the last 10 months or so of our policy in Venezuela. And while sanctions are far from the only part of our policy to facilitate a return to a free and prosperous Venezuela, they are, of course, the most public. So I'm very much looking forward to today's discussion and Eric, Liz, David, Francisco's comments and insights. Of course, my answer to the question, are sanctions working, is yes. But as Moises asked me to speak for more than just a few minutes, I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit. So to evaluate the effectiveness of sanctions, we have to really look at what their purpose is. So certainly on their face, sanctions are in place to prevent the regime from stealing financial resources that rightfully belong to the Venezuelan people. Their assets, the assets of the regime, should be as worthless to them as their economic mismanagement has rendered the bolivar for the people of Venezuela. But sanctions are never merely punitive. The purpose of sanctions is to be used in conjunction with our other economic and political tools to facilitate a political transition. And it's important we deploy all of these economic and political tools now, because every single day we're seeing more and more refugees and displaced persons. It's now over 4.5 million according to the UN. And every single day, we see more brutality, violence, oppression, and harassment against the National Assembly and its deputies, with over 26 deputies having been stripped of their immunities. And close allies to interim President Guaido, including Roberto Marrero, are still in prison on fraudulent charges to this day. And every single day, we see Sabine, Dehessim, and Faiz arbitrarily detain, torture, and kill those whose political views are deemed inappropriate. Almost 7,000 extrajudicial killings in a period of 18 months, again, according to the United Nations. And every single day, we see more and more malnourishment, with reports that it is at an astounding 21.8% back in 2008. So the men, women, and children of Venezuela quite literally cannot wait for the international community to merely hope things will get better. They cannot wait for Maduro to continue to deploy the same tactics he used in talks in 2016, 2017, and again this year in Oslo, to use negotiations to delay rather than achieve a solution. And since they cannot wait, we cannot wait. So how do sanctions fit into this picture? Well, sanctions are a primary means through which we can pressure the Maduro regime to engage in good faith. They are a key complement to our efforts to seek a political transition. So in evaluating whether or not our sanctions have been effective, I want to address two separate questions. The first is concerns regarding our sanctions and their impact on the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. And the second is how these sanctions have affected the core of their purpose, which is the regime's calculus and ability to retain power. So on the first, the Department of State works very closely with the Department of Treasury to ensure that we apply sanctions intelligently and in ways that effectively target malign actors, minimize the disruption of legitimate economic activity, and permit humanitarian assistance such as food and medicine imports. And we also are taking measures to ensure that humanitarian assistance to the Venezuelan people is generally exempted from sanctions. That includes food, medicine, clothing, and other supplies needed to relieve human suffering. But that said, despite all of these carve-outs, the Maduro regime is, of course, keen to blame U.S. sanctions for the economic and humanitarian crisis that Venezuela faces. So this narrative is very clearly false. And it's not just the U.S. that's saying that. The United Nations, the Brookings Institute, Harvard, CSIS, even the Central Bank of Venezuela have all published reports showing that key economic indicators were in rapid decline well before U.S. sanctions were ever applied, and that the decline was particularly acute in Venezuelan oil and food production industries. So the reason we can have such broad sanctions without causing humanitarian devastation is because the entities we are targeting never channeled money or goods to the Venezuelan people in the first place. The Venezuelan people were suffering abject poverty before PDVSA sanctions and never benefited from its oil sector while Maduro usurped power over it. The same is true of the gold industry, 91% of which is unregulated and funnels money to illegal armed gangs, rather than to the Venezuelan people. So the main difference now is that sanctions are hitting the regime's pockets and its ability to provide handouts to themselves, their families, and their supporters. And further proof of where responsibility lies is that even in the midst of all of these sanctions, which are crippling the Maduro regime's access to finances, just take a look at what the regime is spending its money on. Instead of channeling money to food distribution, the Maduro regime and its allies like Alex Saab stole $300 million from the CLAP aid program so their families could have extra spending money in their jaunts through Europe. Instead of channeling $200 million extra to the Venezuelan people to provide much-needed medical care, the Maduro regime signed a contract with the Russians to improve their helicopters and other military equipment. And instead of prioritizing the needs of their people, the Maduro regime prioritized the repayment of debt to Russia, sending the equivalent of $800 million worth of oil to them in the past year alone. And so while the Venezuelan regime is spending money on the Russians and the Chinese, the United States is continuing to focus on the Venezuelan people, contributing over $640 million in humanitarian and development assistance to address the humanitarian crisis. So our sanctions aren't the cause of the humanitarian suffering. They're a means to hasten the departure of Maduro to ensure that suffering stops as quickly as possible. So that gets to the root of the question today. Are they working? People often get distracted with sort of macroeconomic numbers when answering this question, but the effectiveness of sanctions is not really something that can be measured in GDP or barrels per day. We have to measure it against the core purpose, which is to provide support for a political process and hasten the departure of Maduro. And on that, our answer is, again, a resounding yes. Maduro has not engaged in good faith in the past because he believes that time is fundamentally on his side. He can simply wait it out. He can wait for the opposition to fracture. He can wait until the international community loses interest. Sanctions, perhaps more than any other strategy to date, show Maduro that this is wrong and give him the strongest argument for engaging in productive, good faith negotiations. So first, sanctions are fracturing Maduro's inner circle and they're highlighting his growing domestic isolation. We saw this perhaps in most full color on April 30th when key members of his regime were actively negotiating against him with the opposition to force him out of power, and we continue to see it today as more and more members of his regime seek ways out. Second, sanctions are ensuring Maduro is no longer able to rely on his traditional allies. Every day we see reports of more companies avoiding business dealings with the Venezuelan government in oil sales and transportation. In particular, we've seen reports of key allies such as Turkey and China ceasing operations in Venezuela due to sanctions risk, proving to Maduro he will not be able to rely on them to buy him out. And third, and most importantly, sanctions are ensuring a more equitable negotiation process. They impose a cost on the Maduro regime for using his usual tactics of intimidation and harassment to try to weaken the opposition. And most notably, sanctions have given the interim administration of President Juan Guaido enormous leverage to continue working through a negotiated peaceful transfer of power. With more on the table to negotiate, the better. There's perhaps no better proof of the impact of sanctions on this than the fact that sanctions are why Maduro came to the table in the first place. And they continue to be a negotiating point, as we are committed to removing sanctions in exchange for concrete and meaningful actions to restore the democratic order, end human rights abuses, and combat corruption in Venezuela. And there, of course, is more to be done. We certainly can't say that sanctions have caused a transition of power because we have not seen it. Sanctions are themselves not a silver bullet. There need to be other items attached to it in order to make them be effective. Maduro and his regime pose a grave threat not just to Venezuela, but as we are seeing increasingly throughout the region. Sanctions are a critical part of our economic and political pressure. And as Moises mentioned, there is still some resilience. So what else can we do? Well, we're obviously going to continue to deploy sanctions. It's something that we have seen has been the most effective strategy to date to get the regime to the negotiating table. We also need the continued support of European partners and continue to ask them to do more to implement economic pressure against the former Maduro regime to ensure, once again, that he comes to the table and does not use coming to the table to buy time to continue to harass and intimidate National Assembly deputies. Again, this is not pressure for pressure's sake. It is pressure to lead to a political solution. So we appreciate the efforts to further coordinate international actions in support of interim President Guaido and applaud the signatories of the Rio Treaty who are working on next steps using pressure to facilitate a transition as we speak. We also encourage companies, banks, and other institutions to refrain from providing services that support the former Maduro regime's repressive practices, because at a certain point when you know that money is going to the Maduro regime, you are complicit in that repression. And finally, we urge our partners to take appropriate legal measures to deprive Maduro and his cronies of assets held overseas and to prevent travel to their countries. So working together, I'm very confident that our combination of pressure against Maduro and support for the people of Venezuela and the government of interim President Guaido will succeed. I think sanctions are a critical part of this, and I very much look forward to the comments of the panel to hear where they lie as well. Thank you very much for including me in this discussion.
Thank you, Carrie, for those excellent remarks. Before we start the panel, I wanted to spend just 1-2 minutes to clarify a couple of things that we found in our research during deeping into this issue of sanctions in CSIS. Let's see. So we have two big sanctions imposed in Venezuela. One is individual sanctions, right? That are targeting individuals. Right now, we have over 150 individual sanctions, mostly by the US and Canada, but the European Union have also increased sanctions on individuals, and a couple of Latin American countries have done so. But the vast majority of this region hasn't sanctioned individuals on Venezuela yet, which is a big question for maybe for the discussion and whether unilateral versus multilateral sanctions is a way forward, right? And that's one issue. And this research is available on the brief that you found on the registration table, but also on our website. Then we have sectoral sanctions, right? And in Venezuela has been imposed 5 types of sectoral sanctions since just 2 years ago. The first sectoral sanction was in 2017 in August, and it was limiting Maduro's ability to issue new debt, right? That was a very important stop because, as you know, Maduro was refinancing his illicit activities with debt. The second sanction came a year later with the Petro cryptocurrency. Then the banking sector got sanctioned, basically isolating the Venezuelan banking system from the war. And then this year we had oil and gold sanctions, right? But that's important to understand that there are different types of sectoral sanctions, and they all have been imposed only in a window of 2 years. So another question for the table is, do we need to give time to sanctions to work? I mean, usually we found that sanctions, that there are challenges, right? Because if we give time to Maduro, he could adapt to the sanctions as well. So it's a complex issue that we're going to be talking about it later. And to get the conversation started, we're going to start with Elizabeth Rosenberg. She's a senior fellow and director of the Energy, Economics, and Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Thank you, Elizabeth, for joining us. She was a senior advisor at the Treasury to the Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes, and then to Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. And Elizabeth, we're going to start with the big picture first, like sanctions as a tool for U.S. foreign policy, right? Or how is your view on this powerful tool that the U.S. and other countries have, and how is sanctions playing a role in the regions that you most focus on, which are, Iran, North Korea, and other countries? But the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to join you here for this important conversation. And the opportunity to set the stage and offer some framing comments. So I'll offer some very brief framing and themes and try and highlight a couple of items that I know my fellow panelists will discuss and that I think we'll all have the chance to talk about together in the discussion portion of this program. So to begin with, and I think you've foreshadowed this pretty well, I would like to add my agreement that sanctions are quite an important aspect of U.S. foreign policy and national security policy. We could even say a central tool, a tool of choice, a tool of first resort. I think those are all fair ways to gauge their significance to the conduct of U.S. foreign policy. Now, that became the case in the last administration, and most certainly in this administration. There's been an escalation in the use of these tools that's not unique to this current administration, but this one has really added its own special touch and a couple of stylistic features, which I'll come to in a second. So traditionally, sanctions have been used to address and advance core national security or foreign policy issues. And if you've been looking at these for a while or their history, you will recognize their use in service of nuclear security and nonproliferation, countering terrorism and human rights abuses, addressing regional destabilization, sometimes corruption or undermining of democracy, and they've come to be used for more and more, or to advance more and more U.S. policy goals. More regions, more kinds of social or political harms. But notwithstanding this proliferation, which surely is going on, which is carried out by both Congress and the administration, both of whom have the ability to create authorities and to direct their use. But notwithstanding this proliferation, they still remain a primary tool for the topmost national security priorities for the administration. This administration appears to prioritize Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela, amongst other foreign policy issues. I don't want to diminish the significance of this administration's focus on China, for which there's also use of sanctions, as well as other tools of economic coercion. But Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela are three priorities for which there has been extensive use of sanctions. And I would offer that this has been, whatever you think of the policies, it's demonstrated tremendous creativity and versatility in development of tactics. These are economic tactics, and we can and should debate the goals and how well these tactics are being used to implement the goals. But I think there's a lot of credit due to the professionals who have thought about how to best tailor these tools in service of policy. The Venezuela program, let's focus in on that, is a relatively new program by comparison to the Iran and North Korea sanctions. Moises was just telling us, most of these sanctions authorities and their implementation have come in the last couple of years, and really actually in this year in particular, we've seen quite a significant step increase in the authorities and in the pressure applied. It features a number of new modalities of sanctions. Back a couple of decades ago, sanctions were really understood as a kind of trade embargo, whereas in more contemporary times, they are most associated with restrictions on financial movements, banking restrictions, if you will, by distinction to trade. But now these new modalities, and Moises mentioned this, but they cover these sectoral approach, looking at sovereign debt, and some additional, as I was mentioning, stylistic features for this administration that are featured in the Venezuela program include the interest in application of overwhelming pressure and seeking, if you will, this is my rendering, but capitulation on the part of its targets. And a major focus on unilateral action, even when there is shared political prioritization and sentiment around the goal, which is to say, in the Venezuela case, there are many other countries and constituencies that share a concern, grave concern about Maduro and his rule and want to take action, but nevertheless, the United States has moved in a relatively unilateral manner, though there's a caveat to say that, of course, other jurisdictions, including the EU, have put in place Venezuela sanctions, but nevertheless, I think that's one of the features of this administration. Also, its focus on oil disruption, as well as its targeting of Cuba via the Venezuela program, and we could come back to that if you are all interested in doing so. A brief note on what's working and what's not. So this may seem unsatisfactory to say, but I will offer that it's really important to think about, the answer to that comes down to how you understand what the goals are. So we heard in the opening remarks an articulation of several particular goals. That's the right way to grade effectiveness, is to think about performance against particular goals. And for each program, sanctions program, there are different goals. So what we heard before was, I'll just list some of them that were mentioned, freezing assets or holding in place assets for the people of a country, which can help to prevent kleptocracy. And that is a feature, perhaps not of every sanctions program, but of some of the more important ones. I remember that in particular from the case of Libya, in which maybe there are other people here who remember that I worked on that, but that part of the major priority in the last version of the Libya program was to hold in place assets for the Libyan people so that they would not be moved rapidly out of the country by Gaddafi and his family members. And then beyond that, judging effectiveness, I think also unsatisfactory, but the answer is yes and no, and that may change over time. I think it is right to look at the success or failure of certain sanctions goals over time, and of course, it will matter the degree to which the administration continues what is often called maintenance of these sanctions. So to impose them in the first instance and then leave the program alone will almost certainly mean that there will not be success, because of course it's possible to find workarounds. Just briefly on what is working in the case of Venezuela, and then I'll offer a couple of thoughts to close on what may not be working so well. What is working clearly is that these measures are having an economic effect, and that is certainly traced out in some headline economic metrics. GDP, we see this in this Venezuela and other programs, but here inflation, exchange rate, oil trade, and it's challenging to, you have to put it in context, as was made before, and it can be challenging to derive a pure conclusion here because, of course, this was not layered on to a well-functioning economy in the first instance, and for all of those major political priorities, Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela, there has been profound economic mismanagement in the first instance, so it can be difficult to distinguish the particular isolated effects of the sanctions. But certainly, you can assess that there are economic effects. I think another source of success is that the sanctions have been in the past and can be a very powerful mechanism for drawing together political attention and political coalition and support internationally. It can be quite an effective way to also inspire or encourage parallel or related, if not closely coordinated action, and I think that is a feature of the Venezuela program. Okay. Oh, no. I will close with pivoting now to what I think may not be. I've been in situations before where when you're testifying, there's a couple of chairs that tell you, wrap it up. Anyway, in that way. So what may not be working as well is trying to examine in the Venezuela case, are these measures changing the political situation? Are they changing the regime calculus? Now, surely that is something that happens over time, but it may also be the case that these dent the armor but don't destroy the adversary. And if that goes on for the long term, then we may look at these sanctions authorities and discern that, in fact, they are not achieving their purpose. And there are a couple of lessons that I want to offer about that conclusion that I've just said. And the first one may be that, in fact, if you look at this situation and decide that these are not having success as a political tactic, you may decide that there is more economic pressure needed in order to achieve the result. So one of the takeaway lessons could be, it's a start, but it's inadequate to the task to meet the political objective here. A second lesson that I think is worth taking from this conclusion of suboptimal success could be that sanctions are not the right policy tool. They're not the right policy tool for every foreign policy or national security objective that the United States has. And my concern about the proliferation I mentioned at the beginning of my comments of this tactic for many different objectives of the U.S. government is that it's not going to achieve success in every instance. And just because it has in some does not mean we should reach for it immediately, perhaps in this case. And the last one is that you can't judge sanctions alone as achieving for their capacity in achieving the political goal, which is, and this came in the opening comments, that this may be a particularly public tool used by the U.S. administration, but there are others that are necessary, including diplomacy and, in certain instances, a projection or show of military force, and that we shouldn't look only at sanctions for achieving that particular objective. One last thing I want to close with is a cautionary note. I have been working on sanctions issues for about the better part of 15 to 20 years, actually, in some way, and I've seen a lot of evolution of this topic. When I first started working on sanctions, it was very popular and the received wisdom was they don't work. And for people who remember the Iraq example and the humanitarian catastrophe that was associated with the Oil for Food program, then people took the message that these wouldn't work and they were bad, and we should just reject them as a policy instrument. And the trap that people can fall into, deciding that if they don't work, that we should reject them, I find impractical today and utterly tone deaf to the political reality that they are very popular, not just by certain constituencies in the United States, including the U.S. administration, but in many other countries around the world. And they're not going away. So to decide, if you decide that you think they're not working, we should avoid getting stuck in a conversation about the need to reject them, because that isn't happening. Instead, we could focus on how they may best be adapted and the significance of outlining the criteria for their removal in order to affect policy change. I'll stop there.
That was great, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. The last point is very important that I hope that we can deeper into that, and I made a note on it. Next, we're going to hear from Eric Lorber. He's the Director of Financial Integrity Network. Eric was also, similarly to Elizabeth, a senior advisor to the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence at the Treasury not too long ago. Eric, the Maduro regime, one of the big challenges that we have is that this is they're involved in criminal activities, right? And in nature, they work in many ways as a criminal state. So how effective are sanctions to target illicit finance, including money laundering, illegal mining, financing of terrorism, and so on? And I know you have been focusing on this quite a lot. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Moises, and thank you to Liz and to the other panelists, and of course to Das Filippetti. It's good to have some Treasury representation up here on the panel. It's a great question, and I'm going to answer it in a little bit of a roundabout way. And the way I'm going to sort of touch on it is to initially talk about this sanctions program as something of a model. Because I actually see the Venezuela program, which of course has only ramped up in basically the last 4 years, as a good paradigm for how Treasury, state, and the U.S. government develop and implement sanctions, particularly focused on this regime, but also making sure that it extends beyond sanctions to anti-money laundering and to countering the financing of terrorism. Because I think there have been a number of steps that the administration has taken in conjunction with sanctions that have really gotten to that and really helped disrupt the Maduro regime's efforts to finance itself, both as a government, but also their own pockets and line their own pockets. And so I say that that the program itself is sort of a paradigm of a good sanctions program because it rests on what I see as 4 important pillars. The first important pillar is that the program itself has actually increased pressure in an incremental but very logically coherent kind of way. And you don't always see that with sanctions programs. So if you go back to, I sort of date the real beginning of the program to 2016, and then early, I think it was February 2nd, 2017, when the U.S. designated Tariq al-Assami under the Kingpin Act, actually. You began to see a slow ramp up of designations of individuals in the Maduro regime who were A, either associated with corrupt activity, or B, were associated with some types of human rights abuses. And as that initial pressure began to build, it was fairly evident that the Maduro regime was not going to change its behavior. So you fast forward to August 2017, when you have sectoral sanctions imposed that limit certain transactions, in this case, in Venezuelan debt and equity markets and with PDVSA. That program, that element of the program continues, but at the same time, you have what I think is sort of the second real important pillar of this program, which is the matching of sanctions with other tools of pressure. Das Filippetti mentioned this before, but one of the biggest things that, in terms of the pressure campaign that happened, wasn't sanctions related. It was actually the issuance of a FinCEN advisory in the fall of 2017. So I'm just going to assume that we're a sanctions crowd. Some people here may know what FinCEN is, some might not. FinCEN is the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. It's the U.S. anti-money laundering regulator. And in conjunction with sanctions imposed on Venezuelan individuals, this advisory basically told financial institutions, hey, these are the red flags that Venezuelan corrupt actors are using. These are red flags for how Venezuelan corrupt actors are using the financial system to get money out of Venezuela and to line their pockets. And so it gave really important, actionable intelligence to financial institutions. In fact, this advisory was updated just a few months ago around the time of the CLAP program designations to include additional information to help the private sector. So in many ways, what the administration has done is paired the sanctions authorities that they do have with other authorities as well to actually arm those who are on the front lines in the financial sector to disrupt and deter illicit finance activity. Note that, by the way, it's not just the FinCEN advisory that's come out. There has been a very active effort by law enforcement and by the Department of Justice over the last 3 years to indict Maduro's cronies for money laundering activities. And in fact, I advise banks as a matter of course in my day-to-day job. One thing we always tell financial institutions that have exposure to Latin America is if you're worried about sanctions and illicit finance, go read those indictments. Because what those indictments do is they lay out very clearly, hey, this is the type of activity that the Maduro regime is engaged in. Here's how they're trying to move money. And I think that financial institutions really have heard that message loud and clear. The third, thank you. The third sort of core tenet of this program, I think, really has been the focus on evasion activity. And the Treasury Department in the programs that Liz mentioned, North Korea, Iran, to an extent in the Russia program too, have really focused on evasion. But I think that the Venezuela program in particular has really targeted this in a meaningful way. So you've seen both specific designations go after evasion activity, so for example with the CLAP program, but then you've also seen sectoral sanctions used to target evasion activity, as well as designations of essentially material supporters for evasion activity. So on the sectoral program focused on evasion activity, part of the reason that the gold sector was identified specifically in executive order was that the Maduro regime has been selling gold for revenue, right? Selling gold for hard currency in a way or as a way to circumvent the traditional financial system and avoid the impact of U.S. sanctions. Likewise, there was a major designation, I think it was in March of this year, of Evrofinance Bank. It's a Russian-based bank. It's a joint venture between Venezuela and the Russians that was designed to facilitate the effective development and deployment of the petro, the Venezuelan cryptocurrency, right, which is sort of hasn't gotten off the ground. But it was again another effort by the administration to really clamp down, on this type of evasion. And then I think the fourth main pillar for why I think this program is something of a paradigm to look at is the unwinding element. So we've all seen in the last few years the challenges that come with sanctions unwinding and the challenges that if you're unable to unwind a program following behavioral change, the issues that this can cause. I think in the Venezuela program, you've seen both public statements by the administration about unwinding. So if you read the GloboVision designation from, I think, late last year, and if you read the PDVSA press release designation, it makes very clear what the path to these companies coming off the SDN list is. It says, if you do X, Y, and Z, you will no longer be sanctioned. That's really, really important to give these companies and these actors a path in from the cold. And indeed, Venezuela is one of the few programs where you've actually seen sanctions unwinding occur because of a change in behavior. So the Venezuelan, I think it was the Director General of the intelligence agency, was designated in February of 2019, right? And you read the press release, and he's done all sorts of problematic things. He was delisted, and he was delisted. I forget the date. I want to say it was May or June, but I may be wrong on that. He was delisted because he switched allegiances. Because he said, okay, I'm no longer with Maduro, I'm now with the Guaido interim government. And as a result, the Treasury quickly took action to delist him. So that type of incentivization to make sure that if you do change behavior and if you do begin supporting the interim government, that you'll be taken off the SDN list is incredibly important. So with that, I'll stop there and just say again that it's something of a good use of the sanctions tool in the broader context.
Awesome. Thank you, Ariel. That was great. Thank you. Next, we're going to hear from David Smolansky. He's a coordinator of the OAS Working Group on Venezuelan Migrants and Refugees. He's a former mayor of El Hatillo. He was elected as the youngest mayor in Venezuela. David, so a lot of people have come to me and to many Venezuelans, right, and asking whether sanctions are impacting the humanitarian crisis, whether sanctions is now the reason of why people are fleeing this country, whether sanctions is the cause of the hyperinflation in the country. And I think Carrie wisely highlighted a key facts now. But help us understand how are sanctions impacting Venezuelan humanitarian, economic, and political crisis? Is it helping the Venezuelan people? Is it harming the Venezuelan people? Walk us through these issues. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Moises, for inviting me and for having this important conference about sanctions and related to Venezuela. I have visited the region 15 times in this year. I have been in 7 countries, Mexico, Curacao, Aruba, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Argentina. We have had different meetings also with Venezuelan community in different cities in the US, also in Canada. We'll be visiting Brazil next month. We have made approximately almost 1,000 of interviews, and I have not heard the first Venezuelan refugee that has told us that have fled the country because of sanctions. That's a myth. And people are not fleeing Venezuela because of sanctions. People are fleeing Venezuela because of a dictatorship that is not a conventional dictatorship, that has become a criminal state. Venezuela is having, at the same time, 10 million% of hyperinflation according to the IMF. At least 7 million Venezuelans need humanitarian assistance according to the UN. That's 25% of the population. 330,000 people have been killed during these 20 years because of crime, one of the most violent countries in the planet, and Caracas is the most violent capital city of the world. Thousands of people have been extrajudicially killed by fires during the last 18 months. According to NGO Foro Penal, 15,000 people have been illegally detained since 2014, and since March of this year especially, there is a lot of lack of electricity and water. Those are the reasons of why people are fleeing against their will. 4.5 million of Venezuelans have fled as we speak. This is the largest refugee crisis in the history of Latin America and the Caribbean. It is the largest population displaced at the moment with no natural catastrophe and no conventional war. And if we include those who have fled because of a natural catastrophe or a conventional war, we are the second largest displaced population, only behind Syria. And if the Maduro's regime continues, we could be talking of 5 million Venezuelan refugees by the end of 2019, and which is worse, if this nightmare continues to 2020, we could be talking more Venezuelan refugees than Syrian refugees. So definitely sanctions are not the reason of why people are fleeing. People are fleeing because of a very cruel tyranny that is literally separating families all over the country. When I have had some interviews, or when I have had some people that think that Venezuelans flee because of sanctions, I always answer them with a question. Do you think someone is going to walk from Cúcuta in Colombia to Lima in Peru, which is the same to walk from here, Washington, D.C., to Salt Lake City in Utah, which is the same to walk from Lisbon in Portugal to Helsinki in Finland because of a sanction? They walk because they are starving and they're trying to find food. They walk because they're very vulnerable and they're trying to find a hospital because there's no medicine in Venezuela. They walk because they're trying to find a shelter, a place to sleep. That's the reality of Venezuelans. So, in my opinion, sanctions are important on this strategy that the U.S. government has implemented, that the Canadian government has implemented, that some Latin American countries have implemented, and I think it's a very good opportunity, and hopefully with TR that will help more on implement more sanctions against Maduro's regime and also the European Union. And as you said at the beginning, which in that very good brief that CSIS prepared, the vast majority of the sanctions are against the ones who are involved in human rights violation, in illegal activities, very dangerous not only for Venezuelans but for the region, such as drug trafficking, smuggling, illegal mining. That's the way now the Maduro's regime is working, because those illicit activities create billions of dollars. And if there are some of them committed to restore democracy and freedom, as Carrie said at the beginning, that's on the table to negotiate. And at the same time, some of the sanctions that have been implemented, not individual, have an exemption on humanitarian assistance. So there's no excuse in this moment why Venezuela is going through this. It's just an obsession to keep in power and to make people poor and no freedom. It is Venezuelans at the moment is like having a huge. They have been like a hostage. It's a country like more than 25 million people are like hostage of this criminal state. And I remember when I was a mayor, and when it was started, El Hatillo was one of the municipalities with the highest kidnapping rate in Caracas, and we were able to decrease it 80%. And the first time that we had to deal with many kidnappings, if you don't put pressure on the kidnapper, the people will be killed. The people will not be released. But if you put pressure on the kidnapper, this guy has to talk, or this has to do something. So I think the sanctions are very strategic actions on the foreign affairs from the international community against Maduro. It's not the only one. It's not something that is the magic solution. Of course, there are other actions that needs to be done, not only from the international community, by the way, also internally in Venezuela. But I want to be crystal clear here in this conference, and thanks again for having us, that no Venezuelan has fled because of sanctions. That's not true, and with due respect, the people who have said that it is disrespectful, it's not true, and it's an insult for Venezuelans that are literally starving, separating from their families, and being victims on this regime. Venezuela used to be a country that received so many migrants that escaped from war, from dictatorships, from economic collapse. Now we are the ones who are fleeing, and again, it's not for that. So I'll
Thank you.
that.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Just want to highlight there's a group of students from Aruba. I know you've been in the region. You're one of the few experts that have been in the Caribbean. So I want to just highlight that. Welcome to those from Aruba. Maybe we're going to have time to discuss a little bit on the flows to going to the island countries. But first, we're going to hear from Francisco Monaldi. He's a fellow at Latin American Energy Policy at Rice University. Francisco is a leading scholar on the politics and economics of the oil industry and oil wealth management in Latin America and developing countries. He's a founder of the energy program at IESA, one of the best universities in Venezuela, and his background on the academic and professional is just very impressive. You all have his bio and all of these panelists' bios with you. Francisco, what is the impact of sanctions in the energy sector? I mean, this is a heavy dependent oil country, right? And we're targeting the oil sector. So what, in your assessment, what is working on this side and is helping Venezuela or is harming them?
Thank you, Moises. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. So let me start. To answer that question, you need to sort of understand the baseline of what was happening before very briefly. And the destruction of the Venezuelan oil industry started much earlier. Its roots are in Hugo Chávez's administration rather than Maduro's. Of course, Maduro continued the destruction. But just to give you an idea, Venezuela produced around 3.4 million barrels of oil oil before Chavez came into power. Of those, a little bit more than 3 million were operated by Petróleos de Venezuela, the national oil company, and the rest were operated by private companies. When Maduro came into power, production was at around 2.7 million barrels of oil, but very importantly, 1.6 was PDVSA. So PDVSA's production had already collapsed to half of what it was during the largest oil boom in recorded history, and with the resource and the best resource endowment maybe in the world, or at least in the hemisphere. So that's what we have to keep in mind. The private sector, despite the expropriations and all the events, had added, because of projects signed before Chavez came into power, around 1.1 million barrels of capacity. So that was the reality when Nicolás Maduro came into power. Of course, then the price of oil collapsed in 2014, and that, of course, contributed to a further decline. And production, before oil sanctions were implemented, was around 1.3 million barrels, and more than half was done by private joint ventures, and the rest by PDVSA. So PDVSA's production collapsed to 20% of what it was, and it was only partially saved by the oil opening done before Chavez. Moreover, if the deals that had been signed and the plans of expansion of production of Venezuela had been executed, Venezuela would be producing up to 5 million barrels of oil. I'm not talking about crazy ideas of Chavez. I'm talking about serious investment projects. So to give you an idea, while Venezuela's production fell around 40%, OPEC's production without Venezuela increased 40%, right? So the counterfactual that we have to think about is that Venezuela should have significantly increased production. So, I mean, just to mention a few of the roots, of course, are the massive firing of 20,000 employees, the fact that the government over-extracted resources like, crazy, both from the national company and even from the joint ventures. You have the expropriations of not only the international oil companies, but also the service contractors in the Maracaibo region. So plenty of elements that led to basically the other important point is that during the Chavez administration, just one deal that was signed was executed, which was a natural gas offshore project, and that was because it was totally executed by ENI and Repsol, and PDVSA did not participate. So having that baseline to understand, and this is all before oil sanctions, right? So financial sanctions from 2017 did have some impact. However, it's very important to understand that PDVSA was defaulting by the time that financial sanctions were imposed. I mean, just a few months before, the famous hunger bonds were, issued, in which they were paying 50%, interest rates, or they had to give a collateral of Citgo of 50.1%, and not even with that, most of the bondholders were willing to, give money to PDVSA. So it's true that sometimes over-compliance with financial sanctions did make it hard for some joint ventures to operate in Venezuela, but the baseline was a significant decline even before. Oil sanctions since January have had some important effect. As you would expect, that's the objective in part of imposing these sanctions, right? The U.S. was buying about 500,000 barrels of oil from Venezuela, from PDVSA. These were the most profitable barrels because not only, it's close by and in the refineries of the Gulf Coast are the prime market for PDVSA, but also because they did generate cash flow. And a lot of the oil being sent to Asia, both to China and India at the time, was repaying debts with Russia and with China mostly. And so as a result, the U.S. was a really important market. And of course, the loss of the U.S. market, and by the way, U.S. also was supplying more than 100,000, between 100 and 200,000 barrels of diluents for the Venezuelan extra heavy oil to be blended and then re-exported. And bringing those diluents from elsewhere is much more, costly, and so that led to a decline in Venezuela's production from around 1.3 million barrels by the end of last year to today, which is about half of what it was. And in addition to that, more recently, the announcements of sanctions and the enforcement of sanctions since August have led to some buyers of Venezuelan oil to decide not to buy. CNPC, very important, national company of China. There are basically three large foreign players in Venezuela, which are CNPC, Rosneft, and Chevron, and a few others have smaller participation. And CNPC decided not to buy. It's not clear if it's going to be permanent or if it's just while they figure out how they're going to deal with it. But Sinopec, for example, which is not particularly relevant in Venezuela, but they have decided, for example, that they will not hire any tanker that has stopped in Venezuelan ports in the last, 1 year. So you are starting to see a lot of actors from the two most important markets that PDVSA has today, which are India and China, that are, being very careful. It is not something that goes always in the same direction. We were talking about that, for example, Reliance just announced that they are going to buy some cargoes from Venezuela when, the month before, or either in September or in August, exports to India were almost zero. So this varies from period to period. As I said, even today, most of the barrels that were Rosneft, the national company of Russia, is marketing about 2/3 of Venezuelan oil being exported today, and most of it goes to China, India, Malaysia, Singapore. And that has allowed them to get their debt paid very fast. And by the end of this year, they're probably going to be at zero. And there's going to be another debt with the Russian government, but that is in a special grace period. And it's not clear if they are going to use the exports to get that debt repaid. But if not, that will pose a big question here, because it will mean that if Russia and Rosneft continue to export Venezuelan oil, then they will send back cash to Venezuela, except for the part that they swap for diluents or for the domestic market, and so that could, run against the sanctions and could, end up in a difficult situation. So today we are in a situation in which, with this, we haven't said it today, or David said it a little bit, but Venezuela has the largest drop in GDP in the recorded history of Latin America, 2/3, twice the Great Depression in the U.S., more than twice the civil war in Spain. Outside of war, probably we haven't seen something like this almost ever in modern history. So it's astonishing that Venezuela is paying at the rate of about $2 billion, to Russia, and about $3 billion to China as we speak. When of course Venezuela has defaulted on everyone else, no? But that's the reality, and so now, of course, the question is how this will evolve in the future. There are rumors that the Russians are going to have a bigger role in the Venezuelan oil sector. Chevron's license was recently, and other service companies, renewed for 90 days. But if that was not renewed, it could have happened that the Russians could have taken control over those assets. So there are plenty of questions that we don't know what's going to happen, but certainly by the way, it's a difficult situation to assess your second question, Moises, in the sense of how this affects the rest of the economy, because as was mentioned before, first of all, a lot of these barrels go to repay debt, and second of all, it's not clear, how much of the money actually flows to, actual either investment or, services or in Venezuela. But without a doubt, the sanctions have had an effect on the energy sector. And just to finish, I think, and I think the U.S. government is very conscious of this, and I think this is very important, that there has to be a balance between, enforcing the sanctions and understanding that if you do it in certain way, you could destroy the future potential recovery of the oil sector in Venezuela. And so there has to be, Venezuela is a country in which when you close a well, you typically do not, you have to do it again. You have to drill again. So it's very costly to close production. And so in that sense, this is a difficult sort of balance that has to be achieved. Thank you.
Francisco, that was great. I want to follow back on that last point that you made and maybe bring Liz and Eric to the conversation, right? Because I think it's highly relevant that we need to find that sweet spot if we haven't found it yet. Because sanctions are very strategic and they need to increase, right, or continue, but we don't want to destroy what is left in Venezuela, starting with the private sector, NGOs, democratic groups. They all need financial transactions, they all need to operate on the ground. So what is that sweet spot, in your opinion, that the US, Canada, the Lima Group, the European Union, and other countries needs to keep in mind when thinking about imposing sanctions on Venezuela while, limiting the suffering of the Venezuelan people and not destroying what is left on the ground? Liz, in your experience, what's your take on this sweet spot? And Eric, I want to hear from you too.
It's definitely a difficult balancing act, and actually this is a good prompt to bring in a conversation of the so-called day after, which is something that people think about a lot in the case of Venezuela. This refers to, of course, the day after. Actually, I think there's probably various definitions, but it means, you can correct me if you think differently. Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah. The day after there is a meaningful political change, which would elicit removal of some sanctions. We can quibble on what day after means, and I think actually it may be a flexible term because, in fact, this situation of sanctions imposed is going on longer than some people thought when the program first started. I think among some constituencies, there was an expectation that this sanctions pressure and international pressure, political and diplomatic pressure, would cause a political transformation more rapidly. That hasn't happened. Notwithstanding the defection of some, that has, of course, elicited a removal of sanctions. So, day after planning. I suppose I'm a bit jaded, having worked on different sanctions programs and seeing that, in fact, the day after may not come, and if and when it does, and I was involved in some sanctions removal programs, and this administration has also been involved in removing some sanctions. So it doesn't look like what you hope it will look like in many instances. And when you're talking about sanctions that are imposed by Congress, there's a clear empirical conclusion that, in fact, you can't get rid of it. You can possibly substitute some statute and help it to evolve, but they will not go away. And for people who are watching Myanmar and Cuba, you know that firsthand. And even in the case of Venezuela, a day after scenario in the most optimistic rendering would still probably involve continued sanctions on those thugs and corrupt officials that continue to find and benefit from corrupt and kleptocratic activities. And even if there's a political change, it may be difficult to wipe out all of that activity. So what's the sweet spot? I will just add one other comment and then hand over to you all to make some contributions as well. You made a great point about the particular viscous nature of Venezuelan crude, and some of the particularities there mean that turning off production because of economic pressure through sanctions will have it will create greater cost and difficulty and much longer timeframes for turning it back on at a later date. And if one of the real goals of sanctions is to preserve the wealth of the people of a country, then, and as we heard in the opening remarks, then turning off the wealth of the Venezuelan people by essentially condemning an energy industry to start anew, in many respects, would be a very serious consequence to put in place because of the sanctions. Now, we're talking about grave issues and significant political stakes, and there are instances where sanctions programs create powerful, devastating economic consequences. We should look at Iran, for example. And for some people, bringing a country utterly to its knees may be preferable to military action. So I would just say in that balancing point, if you're trying to balance and not bring a country utterly to its knees, then you'd want to keep the oil flowing, at least in some minimal respect. And based on the numbers you offered, we're already down into a quite limited level for production and export. There may just be an opportunity or even a necessity to change the way in which the proceeds are controlled, possibly for the benefit of humanitarian relief, and in order to siphon them completely away from the regime.
Whatever. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think it's a good question, and it's a difficult spot that the administration is in. We have actually haven't touched on one of the most interesting related issues that's coming up right now, which is the potential PDVSA default on the 2020 loan, which of course is creating all sorts of questions about who actually will have access to the Citgo resources that are pledged as collateral on the loan. And I'm sure that the administration has been talking about this, but it's a nasty position, because if you allow for, or if you pull a general license which allows for transactions in the loan, then you could see Citgo pulled apart as a corporate entity by the folks who want to actually, take the money that they were promised when they were purchasing PDVSA debt. That's a problem, because you have the Guaido interim government, which wants to ensure that Citgo, which is one of the only revenue-producing entities as part of the PDVSA empire, they want intact for the day after. And so it's not clear what the best way forward for the administration is on this one, because on the one hand, you could be in a situation where you're basically saying, we issued a general license or permission to allow companies to deal in this debt, and now when they want to get paid for that, when the default happens, they can't get paid. Or that's on the one hand. The other hand is, well, we want to preserve Citgo for the future Guaido regime, which is hopefully a few months in the making. So we can't allow these individual debtors to come after these collateral assets, because if we do, then the one revenue-producing entity within the PDVSA corporate structure will may no longer be available to the Guaido regime. And so it's a really rough position, or a tough position for the administration to be in. In terms of the sweet spot for sanctions escalation, which is what we were just talking about a moment ago, I think Liz has it right. I mean, I think that the extension of the general license, I guess it was yesterday or 2 days ago, for Chevron and for NINOS.
And the service companies.
And the service companies. I wasn't privy to those internal discussions. I will defer to the State Department folks and the Treasury Department folks on that. But I imagine that the question of continuing to allow Chevron and those other service providers to operate within the country turned to an extent on wanting to maintain capability for oil production in a day after situation. And so any type of escalation, I think, would need to take into account what that long-term impact would be. I didn't get to finish my sort of first point when I was initially talking about the gradual escalation. Where I was going with that is what you've seen over the last couple months is an effort to target what are essentially non-Venezuelan material supporters of certain industries in Venezuela. I expect that to continue, and I think that may be the approach to try to limit oil revenue, but again, taking into account that any future designations for shipping activity or for the purchase of Venezuelan crude would have to be done in such a way that it wouldn't deter the any type of capability development within the Venezuelan oil sector itself, which is a very, very hard, it's a hard needle to thread.
Thank you, Eric. Yes, Francisco, I know I'm gonna give you 3 minutes, but I also wanna ask you the sweet spot question, but also we hosted a discussion in CSIS not too long ago about how important will the energy sector will be to rebuild Venezuela's future, right, when we get there. So if you have a minute to spend on that, that would be great. Sure. And the other minute is going to be this question that Liz raised about the oil for food program.
Sure.
And we have a lot of people discussing that as an option. Sure. For obvious reasons, it's very complex. Yes. But I want to hear your take, and then finally David, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. Sure. Briefly.
Sure. I just want to comment briefly on what he said on Citgo. I of course, I'm Venezuelan, and I have a very strong preference on the survival of Citgo as a Venezuelan oil expert. But I think, you know, that even if you consider from just the perspective of the rights of claimants and creditors, I mean, it's very unusual that you have only one group of bondholders that will have access to carve, Citgo, whereas all the others are, and I understand that was at some point in time that was the idea was to put more pressure over Maduro, et cetera, but now it's a different reality. And by the way, the Venezuelan opposition has said that they are willing to negotiate. It's just an issue of, an orderly negotiation, so suspending the effect of that general license, I think it's absolutely essential. But going back to the issues, the recovery of the oil sector will be absolutely at the beginning, the only instrument for or the most important instrument to recover the Venezuelan economy. And it requires about an investment of about $120 billion to get back to the 3 million barrels of production. It requires massive participation from the private sector. And it will be a very challenging endeavor, but I think it can be successful. On the day after of sanctions, one thing that I'm worried about, and you experts on this issue know how that can happen, is that even when sanctions are lifted, even Citgo that has licenses, they tell nobody wants to touch a company that that has been sanctioned in the past, or it's the consequences. Even though you want to help them, the private sector has sometimes incentives for overcompliance or to not.
Can I take 5 seconds? And in addition to that, what you've seen in other instances where sanctions have been lifted and there's an opportunity to invest in an oil industry, so let's look at Iraq and Iran as examples. You might need a new petroleum law, you need real terms, and you need an effective process on the part of the national government, which didn't go well, let's just say, in both of those instances.
Sure, and that's a very important issue, and one that I'm working along with many other people. And in terms of, the other thing, in order to preserve the oil sector, so this is where I think on the issue of preservation of production, to me, there are sort of 2 things that could be useful to do to keep production at some level, but help other issues in Venezuela. One is the oil for humanitarian aid. I think this is, as you say, a very tricky issue because it's, we know the story in Iraq, and we know that Maduro will, try to use that in a way that is not, the way that will be intended. So it will be a very tricky balance to get to sort of both sides to agree on a mechanism. But if that can be done, if the money doesn't flow to Maduro and his cronies, but to actual humanitarian aid, I think that will be beneficial beneficial to keep the oil industry running. And less importantly, but also another alternative is to pay debt to some, for example, Western, oil companies or others that are, doing what the Russians are doing, but if that debt is debt that will be reduced for the new administration in the future. Of course, that is more tricky because it puts them ahead of other creditors, but that's another alternative to keep the oil flowing, but not, the money flowing to the purposes.
Thank you, Francisco. David, 2 minutes. We put up a question on Twitter, and we had a good question came in yesterday. And you can follow us on CSIS Americas and at Moises Rendon. And the question is, and this is coming from @Anamer The question is, David, the UN has been a big proponent of sanctions on countries like Iran and North Korea. How will Venezuela's inclusion in the UNHRC just last week in the Human Rights Council impact the UN's overall ability and willingness to sanction Venezuela for their own human rights abuses? So 2 minutes for that, and we open it up.
Well, just first on the inclusion of Venezuela at the UN Human Rights Council does not represent what the vast majority of Venezuelans want. As a population that suffers every day of human rights violation, and I think it's something that one of the things that UN needs to think and to redefine those type of areas, because not only Venezuela included, but also other countries that are violators of human rights. And the UN could go as far as they could. It will depend a lot on the Russian Federation and China. I remember at the beginning of this year, I was invited to the discussion at the Security Council, where I think that one was Vice President Pence and different Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and just a resolution about free and fair elections. China and Russia vetoed that, and free and fair elections. They were not even discussed about sanctions or whatever. So the UN could go as far as China and Russia are open to change or to shift its position, because Maduro's regime now has been able to keep its power, not only because of the threats that they use or the weapons that they have, but also from the external support, on which, in my opinion, Cuba and Russia are in the same level. You have Turkey. Turkey also is helping a lot. Venezuela, specifically through the mining, and also other satellites, allies in the region and beyond the region that are, contributing to keep Maduro in power.
Thank you. Thanks, David. Okay, you all been very patient. Thank you so much. Just raise your hand if you have a question. Just make sure that you say your name, your affiliation, and go straight to the question. And remember, the question ends with a question mark. Francisco, I just learned that in the... But thank you. Pedro, let's hear from you, and then let's hear from the woman on the back.
Pedro Aurelio from Venezuela, former board member of Petróleos de Venezuela. The decision of using sanctions against PDVSA, the nuclear option, let's say, was discussed all of last year and before. And the reason it wasn't used was because Maduro was doing a fantastic job destroying Venezuela, and there's no need to help him and assume some of the responsibility of what was going to come afterwards. So when you do a sanctions, and I think, Elizabeth, you were talking about it, you come in with a sanction and then trying to figure out if it's working. If you do sanction, you go to a nuclear option, and there's no end game. There's no additional set of things that you're taking to achieve your objective in the short term, and then you begin to actually compound the damage and be blamed for the damage, and suddenly Maduro and his cronies can say the reason that we're dealing with this is because of the US sanction, and they have the power to create that narrative. What do you do then? I mean, you said you double down and do some more sanctions. Is there any time, a case where anybody has to pull a sanction because it's actually doing exactly the opposite of what you wanted to do? Because the particular nature of the people that you're trying to sanction are people who do not seem to care about what happens in Venezuela. And adding to what Francisco said, by the time sanctions were applied, PDVSA had become, and maybe it's the reason that its operating performance had come down, the largest money laundering entity in the entire world. So, I mean, they had turned it from an oil-producing company to a money laundering thing. So that's why the financial sanctions the year before happened. But is there any case where you have to just back away from a sanction because the damage that you're doing to the core of a society is just too big, and if you don't have a better plan to get it already?
That was a good question. Thank you. Let's hold on that. Let's hear from her first.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Hirman. I'm a student at the University of Aruba, and my question is as follows. It was mentioned that there are a few shareholders or countries who invest or rely on the Venezuelan production of oil, but I would like to hear if there are sanctions that may have consequences for CETCO in Aruba, where crude oil is processed by CETCO, while these sanctions are aimed at the Venezuelan government.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Did you get that question, Francisco? That's probably more for you. Got it. Okay, Liz and Eric, if you want to jump in, and David. Okay.
I'll start with the question. Just briefly, so the sanctions in Venezuela, even though they are powerful, they're not at the end of the line. And so, are they the nuclear version? Or they're not. They're aggressive when it comes to Venezuela for the reasons PDVSA, for the reasons we've discussed, because it's the last major revenue generator and hard currency generator, potential for that for Venezuela. But this is not the end of the line, and actually looking to the example of Iran is a good one. The administration's reimposition of sanctions looked to many people like maximum nuclear. That's not a great analogy for that country, but it hasn't been, and so there's still more you can do there. And some of the most recent sanctions with respect to Chinese maritime entities and acting in violation of the Iran sanctions is a good example that there's more to do. In Venezuela, there's more you can do. Nevertheless, it's a good question. What happens if you feel it's not working and it may run counter to your interests? Well, one example we have from that is in the last administration when the Obama government decided that sanctions in Cuba weren't working and weren't serving the purpose and people in fact had lost a sense of what exactly the purpose was. And the administration tried to roll them back to the extent possible that the administration could. That had pretty limited results then because it would require Congress to do more than they were willing to do. And this administration came in and reimposed and doubled down on the Cuba program. So how do you all feel about how that program is doing? Well, apparently there are constituencies close to the U.S. administration that feel like that was a good program to have, and so here we are again. And one thing that the administration can do, though, in the face of the criticism by the target so by Maduro, that sanctions are the cause for humanitarian or economic tragedy and challenge. The U.S. government has, in that instance, sought to try and create economic relief through humanitarian, for humanitarian trade. There is an exception, many exceptions, though there's caveats to that, but in the sanctions law to try and aid humanitarian food, medicine, and medical supplies to go to the people targeted. Also, messages about peer-to-peer exchange. That's something the U.S. administration has done. And also using the language in as many times as it can, press releases, public speeches, to say, if you defect from the government, if you change your ways, we will delist you, and then delisting you. So those are all things that this administration has been doing with respect to Venezuela. You all are the judge of whether those are getting through or not. And I think the premise of your question is that they're not getting through enough.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. And I'd like to add 2 points that I agree with both those points. On the first, the argument that we targeted PDVSA to increase the pressure on the Maduro regime, I think that's right, but I think there were other reasons that they also decided to target PDVSA as well. Phil Petty mentioned one of them, and I actually brought up the PDVSA press release for the designation from January 28th. This is a quote from Secretary Mnuchin. Today's designation of PDVSA will help prevent further diverting of Venezuela's assets by Maduro and preserve these assets for the people of Venezuela. So the purpose of the sanctions was to pressure in part, but it was also to preserve assets to ensure that they were frozen so they couldn't be looted. That's kind of the first point. The second point, in terms of your specific question, have there been examples where sanctions have proven too powerful, and so there's an effort to effectively roll them back? And I think Liz mentioned some good ones from a number of cases. The one that comes to mind to me is in the Russia case with Rusal EN+. So I don't know if folks here are read into this conversation, but if you recall from April of 2018, the U.S. designated a number of Russian oligarchs, including Oleg Deripaska, right? Oleg Deripaska owned EN Plus in Rusal, which is one of the world's largest aluminum producers. Immediately, and when the designation happened, the world aluminum markets reacted fairly negatively, and the U.S. issued a general license which allowed for transactions to continue with Rusal EN Plus, and then over a period of about 10 months, negotiated the exit of Deripaska's ownership, a certain percentage of his ownership, and his control, to the point where earlier this year, Rusal EN Plus came off of the list because Treasury had determined that it was, in effect, no longer owned or controlled by a designated national. I think that's a good example where there was a designation that happened. There was a realization that the impact of that designation, if there was no exception, a general license, or Rusal EN Plus didn't come off the list, was going to be too substantially detrimental to world aluminum markets. And so there was an effort to figure out a way how to take that company off of the list in a way that still preserved the objectives of the sanctions programs, which was to pressure and pressure Deripaska.
Yeah, Francisco.
Yeah, very briefly. Well, on sort of diminishing the effect of the sanctions, particularly the narrative and the rhetoric, I think this is something that we have to think hard. And the issues like the one we mentioned about oil for humanitarian aid could be one in which you put the ball on the side of Maduro to accept. I mean, if you prepare a reasonable program. On the Aruba issue, unfortunately, the latest news that I have heard about that is that Citgo is canceling their contract with Aruba. I mean, that was a project that was created by the former president of Citgo and then president of PDVSA, recently died of a heart attack. And apparently that project, wasn't, I mean, it was a project that most people, technical people in Citgo didn't consider was an attractive and reasonable project, and they spent tons of money, and there was a lot of corruption and issues. So I think probably I think there are opportunities, by the way, with Arriba Refinery to do things in the future connected to the Venezuelan oil industry. I don't think we have to discard that, but for now it seems that this is going to be canceled.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we run out of time. I want to be respectful of your time, but I will encourage you to come and speak to the speakers after the event finish. Thank you so much to all the experts. Thank you to Carrie Peticca, and thank you for all of you to coming. Thank you.